That was so interesting. I've learned something from each and every one of you. Now we have Morgan Cannon, who is recovery and restoration and works for the National Forest Foundation. There you go.
So much.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Morgan Cannon. I work for the National Forest Foundation, and thanks so much for having me here today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the National Forest Foundation, we are the congressionally chartered nonprofit partner to the U.S. Forest Service. So what does that really mean? You can think of the NFF as the official partner to the Forest Service, very similar to how locally we have the Rocky Mountain Conservancy, and they work to support that on-the-ground project-based volunteer work, trail work, veg work, the list goes on and on. Here at Rocky Mountain National Park, the NFF operates in a really similar fashion, but in forests all across the United States. So the NFF has project coordinators and managers such as myself in forests across the US. But I'm actually based here in Estes Park, Colorado, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about my work with recovery and restoration, specifically focused on post-fire recovery on the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forests. All right, a little sense of place for us all. So I put up a map here. I'm not sure, we probably have a varying level of familiarity with the forest. I'm sure folks who are local are really familiar with Roosevelt National Forest here in our backyard. But the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest extends from the southern border of Wyoming, almost all the way down to the I-70 corridor, and then west into Granby. And we have Estes Park here, so you see the exclusion area, that's Rocky Mountain National Park. So we're sort of smack dab in the middle of this forest system. And the ARP, the acronym I use, the P is Pawnee National Grassland, also a very important ecosystem, but will not be part of my conversation about reforestation. And the project I'm focused on sharing with you all today is about reforesting burned landscapes on the forest. So we're going to be talking about some forests that were impacted primarily by the 2020 fires, so East Troublesome, Cameron Peak, and the work that I'm doing at the National Forest Foundation, as well as with my partners to reforest that landscape. So what's the need? We've been talking about fire all day, so it feels like we're really familiar with what the need might be for reforestation. A couple things to grab onto here. The 2020 fires burned over 25% of the ARP. Now, that number is not the direct need of what needs to be reforested. We talked a lot about fire severity, about how fire is a mosaic on the landscape. It's not a contiguous burning fire that affected the landscape equally, right? So after the fires, there was a lot of modeling and assessment of, okay, what types of ecosystems were actually impacted by this fire, specifically what type of impacts were had by high severity portions of the fire on the landscape, on the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest specifically. From those assessments, we determined this level of need, right? So there's this figure, 200,000 acres are in need of reforestation on the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest. When you're determining the need for reforestation, there's a lot of things that go into that consideration. We've talked a lot about how we have fire-adapted ecosystems here in northern Colorado. So there is natural regeneration and natural recovery happening after these fires. But in some instances, there was high severity fire where we're losing some integral pieces to the landscape. And that's when we're really stepping in as land managers to help kickstart this recovery. So what we're focused on is high severity fire areas that are impacting some key watershed and forest health systems. The focus today, because I only have so much time, we're going to talk about where we saw high severity fires and we lost these seed sources. So we lost the mature trees that are able to help kickstart restoration, and where we're finding patchy or absent regeneration. So sometimes it's present on the landscape, sometimes it's patchy, and sometimes it's absent. And there's a variety of factors that determine whether something's going to naturally regenerate after fire and when it won't. But again, we're focused in on that high severity effect. So when we're having an increase in soil moisture, we're not seeing some of those species such as lodgepole with their serotinous cones that open after fire. We're not seeing that happen. we're losing some of these processes because of this high severity fire and the impacts on the landscape that change the condition. So, a high severity fire and the need for reforestation, it has this cascading effect on other variables as well, right? We're seeing a high degradation to our water quality. We're seeing large impacts to watershed and communities such as this one. And of course, we're seeing a slower overall ecosystem recovery where we're losing these large landscape features such as forest types and forest overstories. Okay, so my focus here today is I want to talk to you all about what's actually being done on the ground. What does this process look like when I say reforestation? And it starts years before we're ever putting a tree in the ground. So the first step of this process on a lot of our federal lands here in Colorado is getting an inventory of that forest composition. Basically, think of this as let's capture a snapshot in time of what the landscape looks like after fire. We're really lucky right now in time and space because we have all this amazing technology with LiDAR and drones and modeling, but there really isn't a substitute for having people on the ground, right? People who can have discrimination towards some of these key features that we're looking at, and they're able to capture data that's really important to land managers for a specific task, such as planting trees. So we have folks who go out into the ground after fire, and we have a lovely picture here. This is actually the East Troublesome fire. This is on the opposite side of the divide outside of Grand Lake. We're doing a regeneration survey. So the first thing we're looking for is anything naturally regenerating? Do we have any trees on the ground that have regenerated after the fire? And I'll say we're typically doing these surveys about 4 years after a fire, right? We want to allow the landscape time to naturally regenerate, to recover on its own. And 4 years is sort of this appropriate buffer for us to come in and make these assessments and make a determination if there will be natural regeneration or if we need to have some reforestation activities. So what's natural regenerating? And that is, is there any natural regeneration? What types of species are we finding regenerating? And at what density? That's also really important for our landscapes. We're looking at if there are any mature trees that could be used as a seed source. We talked a bit about in an earlier presentation about how we have different trees, conifer species in northern Colorado that use different methods to spread seeds, right? We see our large seeds, like the most characteristic is our limber pine. Those are really investing in birds and animals spreading seeds. And then we have smaller seeds, like on our firs and spruce with really large wings. They're using wind, right? Well, you'll find that in a lot of these surveys, it's really intensive on people power, right? We have people on these landscapes that are walking over dead end down. Access roads are really impacted by fire. There's flood. There's a lot of loss. So we sort of need these quick and dirty metrics, right? So one that kind of sticks with me is when you're determining if there's mature trees on the landscape that could be a seed source for you. One rule of thumb that we use is that if I'm on the landscape and I see a mature tree, if it's fallen down on top of itself twice into my plot, it's feasible that that seed could reach where I'm at, right? So you see a 50-foot tree when I'm surveying, if I'm 100 feet away, then reasonably it might be able to regenerate this location. It's not an exact science, and a lot of field work isn't that. But that's just sort of a visual impact that you can think about when you're traveling these landscapes and you're seeing either the presence of mature trees or the absence, right? It sort of indicates how likely the system is to recover on its own. And then we're also looking at shrub species, invasive species, and site access, things that we might not be able to gather after the fact, but might help us create a clearer picture. The next step of the process is to determine what we call the seed need. So the seed need is basically land managers, so in this case, the U.S. Forest Service, saying, what do we want back on the landscape, right? Again, a variety of factors are going to go into this. We're thinking about what was historically on the landscape, what stage of succession do we want to put back onto this landscape, what's currently on the landscape, right? And oftentimes land managers have these 10-year plans for what they want the forest to look like, and it's delineated through priority watersheds, habitat types. There's a variety of influence that go into these seed plans, but we're drawing from those seed plans and we're saying, okay, What do we want back on the landscape? We know what's there, we have our snapshot from our surveys. What do we want back on the landscape? The next question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the seed inventory to support that vision that we want back on the landscape? This is something that I think is a little bit unique with public lands, this idea of seed inventory. I think a lot of folks, maybe in this room, that have been impacted by fire and maybe have or planted trees in your yard for a variety of reasons. I think there's an experience of going to a nursery, such as One Canopy down in Loveland or the Colorado State Forest Service Nursery, two great partners, and ordering a lot of trees or ordering seeds online, growing seeds, what have you. Something like that is not feasible on Forest Service land, right? There's an aspect of public land to it, but there's also just the intensity and scale of what we're looking at, right? If we remember that figure from earlier, we had 200,000 acres of need. When you're thinking about a private landowner reforesting after a fire, you're at such a smaller scale, and really what that comes down to is that you're able to give a larger amount of care and attention to the trees that you're planting, right? If you're planting 100 to 200 trees on your property, you're able to visit those trees quite often in a season, in a year. You're maybe setting up irrigation, you can do pest control, right? You're able to monitor those trees pretty intensely. When we're putting trees back onto the landscape in, hundreds of thousands of acres, we're not able to have that next level of care after we plant the trees, right? So one way that we make sure that we're investing in quality planting that's going to have a high chance of survivorship and a good genetic integrity that's going to be productive on the landscape is by sourcing our own seed inventory. And it's really about matching the seed inventory to the site. Okay, stick with me. So we did our priority surveys. We have our snapshot in time, right? We know what's on the landscape. We've talked to our land managers. We know what we want back on the landscape. And we realize, hey, we don't have the seed to support that. Because this is the very real scenario that's happening on the Arapaho Roosevelt National Forest right now. So what we can do is we can develop a plan for what sites we want to reforest, where's our priority sites, and then from that seed list, we have a list of species that we want there. So then we're actually going back out into the landscape, into healthy, non-burned areas, and we're finding seed that match our projected site. And this is for a variety of reasons and a variety of considerations. I would say the most important takeaway from this slide and the easiest tangible thing to think about is matching elevation bands. We had that wonderful graphic earlier with the different forest types cascading down into lower elevation. This is one of the key factors when we're thinking about cone collection, right? So if I'm planting ponderosa pine at 9,000 feet, that's my priority site, that was burned, this is a high need for us, this is our priority. I want to find matching seed that has developed and contains similar genetic information to allow it to survive at 9,000 feet, right? And you can get into the specifics too, where we're matching aspect, we're matching slope, we're matching these site conditions as best as possible to put that investment into the seed, because again, we're not going to be investing that much into the tree after it's in the ground, so we want to give it the very best chance of survivorship. It created a bit of a problem though. As you can imagine, the forest is huge, and trying to find these populations of cones that we can collect for these priority sites, it's a daunting task. I would say bolstering seed inventory is probably one of the largest challenges that forests face right now in the face of reforestation, because it's so time intensive. So I worked together with the Lambert County Conservation Corps last year in 2025 to pilot what I was calling a cone crew. They were individual site placements, so we had 4 of them. 2 of them were based in Fort Collins, and they were working up in the Red Feather area and on the Poudre, the Canyon Lakes district of our forest. And then I had 2 folks who were over in Grand Lake, and they were servicing the Sulphur Ranger district. So their jobs were to find the seed on the landscape. And I'm sure a lot of folks here in Estes have seen maybe bigger ears than I have, but have seen those cones on the landscape, right? You're walking around town, we have our gorgeous ponderosa pines, you see those beautiful stars of cones that are on the landscape, right? So their job is to find those crops, right? To find seeds on the landscape that look viable and healthy. And there's a lot of science that goes into it. I promised myself I'm not going to get bogged down with this slide, but please talk to me afterwards, anything about cone ecology. We are so lucky here in northern Colorado with the resources that we do have, because again, reforestation is something that a lot of forests, national forests and public lands are taking on, but there's also a lot of unknowns, right? As we increase pace and scale of this work, there becomes even more unknowns. So one resource that I put up here is actually a publication from CFRI, Maren Chambers, and work with Catherine Schlegel as well from Nature Conservancy. So we have folks at CSU and other research institutes that we work closely with that are studying this, putting out publications about cone health. Again, there's just so much investment into getting quality seed to make sure that we have the best possible outcomes in planting. I've also included our map of where our crews were in 2025. So all of these red dots, sorry for the folks in the back if you cannot see those, but these are all individual points that were, hey, this is a viable site where we might be able to collect cones. And then here in the green are actually 2 of our cone collection units. A little bit about what goes into this work. There's a lot. So once we find a site, so the crews are out, they're communicating with me and they're saying, hey, we found a really good population of, let's say, ponderosa pine. Seems like there's a lot of producing trees with a lot of cones. They seem healthy. I'm then relaying that information to the Forest Service and I'm letting them know, hey, we found ponderosa pine. It's at 9,200 feet. It's at this site. Does this fit into our seed need? Is this part of our plan? And they could say yes or no or maybe or I don't know. But in this case, I'll talk a little bit about our pilot year. They said yes. So we found this site, Lady Moon Trailhead, if any of you have spent time up near Red Feather area. We stayed on this site. We did a lot of trainings on this site. We had experts down from New Mexico come up and talk to us about some of their lived experience with cone collection and sourcing seed for, again, this investment in reforestation. And we're actually going out ahead of time and we're finding individual trees on our site, about 50 trees on the site is what we're targeting, that look healthy. So they have qualities that we want to be seen on our reforestation site. The Forest Service is definitely partial to strong, straight, good form trees, and so that is primarily what we're seeking. But there's also consideration on site for trees that have kind of been through it, right? Like they might have some strong genetic stock. If they're a little mangled, they've seen fire, they've seen lightning, and they're still standing, right? So there's considerations in both boats, but we're actually marking these trees ahead of time, which climbers will eventually go up into. And then we're monitoring these cones. It's an intensive process. So we're actually cutting the cones open, I'd say about once a week, up until we start seeing really strong embryo development. So within the seed, oh gosh, now I'll stop myself from doing any diagrams on the cones, but you can monitor cones and you can almost predict the exact day that they're gonna pop, right? Seeds and cones, they stay closed up when it's really wet, and when it gets dry, they open up, right? And then they spread their seeds, for ponderosa species specifically, but many other cone species. So there's some predictability in cones and when they're gonna drop, and one indicator of that is embryo development. So we're going out with our hand lens, and we're looking every day, and then the crew tells me, hey, the embryo's at 90%, we need to mobilize. Cones are a gambling game, and I'm not much of a gambler, but in this case scenario, we kept on our cones, we kept monitoring, we kept cutting cones, and then we had the next step of our process, which was collecting cones. Yeah, this was great. Again, a pilot year, so a lot of humility in this work, I'll tell you. So for this project, we worked with myself at the National Forest Foundation, our partners with the U.S. Forest Service, and our partners at American Forest as well. So we all worked together to put out a contract for arborists. So you'll see here, for our cone collection events, we have arborists who would actually climb into the trees, and this is specific to ponderosa trees. You can imagine that different species have different ways of harvesting cones. I can't imagine climbing a lodgepole pine. I think it would snap. But for our ponderosas, we have these arborists, and they go up and they climb to the tops of the trees, and then they send the cones down, and then we're actually processing them on the ground. And by processing, it mostly just means we are consolidating them into specific units of measurement so that we can track their inventory. We're removing pine needles, twigs, sometimes bugs, whatever, anything that could sort of encourage mold growth in this process, we're removing. And it should be noted, maybe you're asking yourself, well, why are you climbing? Can you put up a ladder? Can you have people maybe cut cones down, what have you? An important part of this piece is collecting from the top 1/3 to 2/3 of the canopy because again, as many people are experiencing now, probably especially down in the Front Range, you're finding pollen on your car, on your clothes, what have you. We have this pollination and fertilization that happens up in the canopy through wind. So we're just finding higher rates of fertilization up in that 1/3 of the canopy because of our pollen, and so that's actually producing the most amount of seeds and the best seeds that are the most viable. So that's one reason that we have climbers go up instead of collecting from canopies that we could reach with tools. But it went successfully, and we got about 100 bushels of ponderosa pine cones. This was over 2 sites actually. We had collected so much at that first site that we mobilized to a second site we had set up. So this was at Lady Moon Trailhead and Lost Lake Trailhead up in the Red Feathers area. And I'll say it all depends on germination rates, which require testing, but 100 bushels of this species would, on a very generous low end, give us the potential for 700,000 trees. So what happens next? So we bushel up all of our cones, we put them in a burlap sacks, so they have some breathing room, but not too much. Again, we start playing the game against time and mold. We then send these cones over to a nursery, and the Forest Service uses a federal nursery over in Nebraska, in Halsey, Nebraska. It's called Bessie, and this is the oldest federal native plant nursery that we have in our system. It's great. They're pushing out about 2 million trees a year. So we send the cones over on a refrigerated cooler to the nursery, and then they have quite the journey there. My next slide is a video. I don't know if it's going to work. If it doesn't, we'll move past it and pretend it didn't happen, but if it did, it's just a process of what Bessie does with their cones and how they begin to process it and actually get the seeds out of the cones. And I apologize if it's really loud. Oh good, no sound. Okay, so it comes down from this bin here, and it goes into this tumbler, and seeds are falling out in that tumbling effect because they have opened up, and then all the excess cones that don't have any seeds go up this conveyor belt into this tractor trailer, and then they get composted, right? So you're letting the cones cure for, it depends on the species, but a couple months, so they naturally open up, and then we're tumbling them, the seeds fall out, you pick up the seeds, you have seeds. A couple of nursery photos. I work there, so I'm partial, and I'm like, who else is going to look at these photos? But yeah, so this is the Region 2 nursery. So the next journey of this seed's life is that it's actually going to be planted into a container. I have a QR code for anyone who wants to see this process. I made a video about it a while ago. They're going to be grown out into these containers for about 2 years. And then after 2 years, they're packaged and frozen and then shipped to a forest near you, right? And so we actually had our first planting last year. So the trees were shipped to us, and then we mobilized with them. So in 2025, we piloted tree planting with the Forest Service here on the ARP. So a tree planting operation, there's a lot that goes into it, but again, this conversation, I promised reforestation, I'm just now getting to the tree planting aspect of it all. So we have contracted crews that'll come out and plant trees. They're planting trees on really brutal landscapes, right? This middle picture here is on the Williams Fork burn scar. This is over near Fraser. You're walking over a lot of dead and down, really steep slopes. This was on the south-facing aspect. We were planting lodgepole pine. I don't know if the photo quality is good enough, but I promise that's a lodgepole pine. It just grew like gangbusters in the nursery, so the needles are really long. I had to double check. I was like, are you sure these are ponderosa? Anyways, so they have these highly skilled crews. I mean, these people are pushing out 1,000+ trees a day. And that might be a hard number to understand, but I could maybe do 200 trees a day, right? It's a feat. So again, expanding on that work. So in 2025, we piloted this partnership, And the partnership is really, the National Forest Foundation and our partnership is meant to enable the Forest Service to operate at a higher scale and with increased efficiency. So in a time, especially in 2025, where there was uncertainty about funding and timing and approvals in the Forest Service, we were able to get it done. So we were one of only 2 forests in our region, so Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, who were able to put together a planting this last spring. And that's because of our partnership and the way that NFF is able to operate and support the Forest Service. And that was on the Williams Fork in East Troublesome. This was on the west side, but I put up some facts and figures about our acreage, our species composition, and the number of seedlings. And I just want, for context, these are really small plantings. This is a pilot year. This is us kind of moving through this partnership and seeing how it works and finding the flaws so we can fix them. But we really want to up these numbers and these acreages quite a bit. So in 2026, this spring, we're going to be planting on the Cameron Peak burn scar. So we're going to be planting up the Poudre Canyon on Highway 14, and we have a new variety of species as well. It doesn't stop when the trees are in the ground. Like I had told you, again, these trees are in the ground and we're not able to really give it that intensive care that you might at your home with trees, but that doesn't mean that we leave them to the wolves per se. We're doing a lot of post-planting monitoring, right? We're trying to learn from these plantings to continue that investment in learning and creating the best possible outcome we can for these trees and for these landscapes. So post-planting monitoring, there's a variety of ways to do this, but basically we're revisiting the site 1 year, 3 year, 5 years after the fire, or after the planting, excuse me, and we're seeing, did things survive or not? So success, of course, looks like a high survivorship of trees. It means that we did our job in communicating with contractors and directing a successful planting. If anyone has been at Rocky Mountain National Park, they do volunteer plantings. I was out last year doing limber pine plantings, and it was awesome. We had about, 30 volunteers. We planted maybe 400 trees, and you were able, I saw people building up like little houses around the trees and digging wells, and that's awesome. That's so cool. But at scale, it's really hard to do that. So it's finding the balance between micro-siting, creating these awesome little habitats for them, and also getting them in the ground so we can continue this work at scale. What does failure teach us? Timing for planting. We need to think about our timing. Right now, we're taking the approach of planting in the spring, trying to capture that moisture coming off of winter and into summer. Last year, we were planting in the rain, which was brutal, but great for the trees. We might have to change that moving forward, right? Our planting's scheduled for June, and we don't know what's going to happen with our weather. Climate's constantly changing, local weather's changing, so we might, if we're finding a lot of mortality in trees, we'll shift our plantings to the fall and try to capture some of that fall or winter moisture. Planting protocols, how can we communicate better how we need trees planted? There's a lot of nuances that go into planting a tree that you don't realize until you're in a horrible, rocky area and you're trying to put a tree in the ground, but there's rocks and boulders in the way. So how can we communicate that better? And in the same idea, are we choosing the correct sites? If we're finding a lot of mortality, we're wasting time and energy. We need to choose sites that are still within these priority areas, typically priority watersheds, that are complementing other work that's being done, but that are also seeing success and change. Ooh, okay, that was a lot, right? Sorry, I'm just trying to shove my whole life's work into a couple minutes here. And I put this slide together and I was like, that's kind of a really intense slide. So I promised you all to talk about reforestation, and you might have noticed I really didn't get to it until the very end. Reforestation, a planting, that's what people think of, right? It begins, and my message really is just, it begins so many years before the planting, before a tree is ever put into the ground. And it starts with establishing these partnerships, these agreements, this collaboration with researchers and land management professionals. It's setting up systems for seed inventory and partnership, workforce development, trainings. There's so much that goes into it. And the need here in Northern Colorado is immense. There's no denying that there's a backlog of reforestation needs in our burned landscapes, that there's community and watershed needs. But it does give me a lot of hope here in Northern Colorado because there's an investment in collaboration. There's people who are willing to stand up and show up, come to the table. I am starting with some partners, the Colorado-wide Reforestation Network, to make sure that no one's operating in silo, that we're sharing information as readily as we can to make sure that we have successful outcomes. I manage the Northern Colorado Working Group, and we're focused on reforestation. It's really just about connecting people who are interested in this work and investing in these outcomes, right? The forests that we want 50 years from now, 80 years from now, 100 years from now, they're dependent on the decisions and the partnerships that we make today. The investments that we're making today will shape that. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone in this room for being part of that investment and being here today to learn a bit more about how we can live with fire. So thank you.